What if I told you that the Star Wars sequels actually did something right? Wait, let me rephrase that. It's 2022 and the world is a mess in a lot of ways, like a whole bunch of ways. Honestly, it's been like this for a while, and well, our media reflects this, and the particular dimension of this waking nightmare we call existence that I want to talk about today is the way that pop culture reflects and comments on one particular idea which is becoming more and more relevant in today's society, somehow. And it's an ugly one: fascism.
I think I'm a fan of the 21st century.
Yeah, don't get your hopes up. We make a mean prosthetic, but fascism is back.
But this video isn't about that directly, so I won't be talking about how New Age populism and propaganda has shifted the Overton window so far that openly fascist rhetoric has become globally dominant right-wing discourse. No, not focusing on that. Instead, I want to talk about a slightly less terrifying corollary of that same phenomenon: the ways that fascist symbology and iconography is used in today's fiction and broadcast media. Specifically, I've got two examples in mind. One, I think, gets it right and understands the weight and meaning behind invoking fascist imagery. The other, well, doesn't. It uses its cinematic language to call to mind the horrors of fascist regimes past with a flippancy which fundamentally undermines whatever point it's trying to make. And here's a shock: the good example of this is from the Star Wars sequels. I'm thinking of that moment from The Force Awakens where we're introduced to General Hux, the First Order, and Starkiller Base. The counter example is from Russell T Davies' BBC adaptation of Shakespeare's play A Midsummer Night's Dream, and the particular way John Hannah's character Theseus and his tyrannical regime is portrayed. Yeah, these are two quite different examples, but I think looking at them together is productive, because it tells us what sorts of purposes can and can't be served through evocations of fascist iconography. So let's talk about Star Wars. The first time we get a proper look at the might of the First Order comes on Starkiller Base, just before the big ol' laser destroys the Hosnian system. And this introduction is a scene of Hux delivering an impassioned speech to the First Order's stormtrooper legions. Already, visual parallels are obvious to the surviving images and footage we have of Mustache Man's rallies in pre-war Germany. I'm being vague for the purposes of avoiding demonetization. This video could well cross that line anyway, I'm genuinely not sure, but I'm gonna do my best to avoid it. So yeah, you know who Mustache Man is. But there's a few specifics to this scene which evoke these fascist aesthetics in more nuanced ways than just general visual similarities. As we see Hux make his speech, the camera moves through waves of stormtroopers, who incidentally get their name directly from the German fascist police, but yeah, you probably already knew that. The first thing I want to talk about though is the conspicuous echo we hear on Hux's voice.
This fierce machine which you have built, upon which we stand, will bring an end to the Senate.
This is hardly space-age technology, and yeah, Star Wars tech is often less than perfect, but I'm struggling to recall another speech scene in the saga with such conspicuous echo. For us, viewing the film in an age where slick production and mic usage tends to eliminate this sort of distracting reverb, the result is a decidedly retro feeling, calling to mind the recordings we have of speeches and rallies from early in the 20th century. So keep this idea in the back of your mind, because we're going to move, for now, from the sound of Hux's voice to what he's actually saying. The central topic of this speech is the First Order's impending attack on the Senate. The way this is framed, though, as the impending, quote, end of the Republic, is directly reminiscent of post-World War I Germany. At that point, the country was a republic, called the Weimar Republic, until a certain fascist and his followers successfully destroyed this republic. That's not to say that they just got in power, they officially dissolved the republic, replacing it with the so-called Third Reich. Returning to Star Wars, we also see a fragile republic, established after a disastrous war, being overthrown by an anti-democratic movement which exploded from the fringes and into power shortly thereafter. Like the presence of soldiers named after the historical stormtroopers, The Force Awakens' focus on the overthrow of the failing Republic isn't in any way unique to this scene, but that's not the point. The point is that this particular scene makes a point to foreground these details and plot points, all in front of a massive waving red cloth emblazoned with insignia directly evocative of Mustache Man's regime and all the oopsies they carried out. Again, sorry, but if I'm not frustratingly vague, this video will be severely restricted. And the result is a scene that works. By casting the First Order as Proud Boys-esque fascist revivalists, two things happen. The most obvious one is that by drawing on these visual and ideological echoes of this evil philosophy, the film essentially accesses a shortcut in its viewers' brains, which allows it to quickly establish this new faction as a serious, insidious threat. If nothing else, that's good filmmaking. But to me, the second thing is more interesting. It manages to do all this to invoke the fascist horrors of our past in a way that doesn't feel cheap. Part of this is due to the fact that this faction, the First Order, actually fits the bill pretty well for the reasons above from an in-universe perspective, and part of it is because this idea of fascist revivalism The Force Awakens uses is something of a meta-narrative, because in the real world, well, roll the clip again.
Fascism is back.
The original Star Wars trilogy were nostalgia films, harkening back to Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers, and cowboy films, but also constructing the Empire to be a sci-fi reflection of the fascist states whose actions defined the childhoods of many older people watching these films back in the 70s and 80s. One of the things those films were doing by having the Jedi vanquish the Empire was staging an imagined victory over those all-too-real forces to evoke a sense of optimistic nostalgia. And in a minor way, The Force Awakens is doing the opposite, commenting on the way that extremism, intolerance, nationalism, and authoritarianism are able to grow in the shadows of a failing democracy. I mean, look around you, it's happening. The point of all of this is to say that The Force Awakens takes a very delicate subject and treats it in an appropriate way, both from a filmic perspective and an ideological one. And when it comes to modern media approaching the ideas and aesthetics of fascism, that's rarer than you might think. For an example of what I mean by this, let's take the Davies adaptation of A Midsummer Night's Dream. First though, I'd like to make it clear that I've nothing against Davies, or even some of the more controversial parts of this adaptation. Please don't take this section as, like, me dog-whistling against the LGBTQ undertones, or, I guess, overtones, of this adaptation. To be honest, I think a lot of these features are pretty close to the spirit of Shakespeare, and to the original play specifically. But I do think that this play's version of Theseus and of Athens is monumentally misguided. The general philosophy of this adaptation is one of textual fidelity, and as such, it results in a broadly faithful script, in that while many lines are cut, and a few are moved around, the film doesn't habitually make up lines. Pretty much anything you hear is Shakespeare, and this means that much of Davies' unique interpretation is visual, or at least non-verbal in nature, which in this case has led to some pretty massive overcompensations on the part of Davies, most obviously the blatantly fascist aesthetics adopted by Theseus. This is how this character has appeared in other adaptations. And this is what Davies gives us. Theseus is the Duke of Athens, a state which in this play has some pretty repressive and invasive laws. If women don't marry whoever their father wishes, they face the death penalty or are forced to become nuns, so not ideal. Theseus upholds this law, which has sometimes been considered, to use the technical parlance, a dick move. But upholding this repressive law is pretty much the worst thing he does in the original text. So Davies read this and thought, hey, I know what I'll do. Make him a Nazi. The end result is something like putting a swastika on the Grinch. Yeah, I see the general point you're trying to make about intolerance or whatever, but good lord, is it in bad taste. And more to the point, in reducing the meaning of fascism to merely representing something that's bad, you're eliding the nuances of a belief system which is actively trying to make a comeback. It makes it all seem less real and more like a pantomime, which in my opinion is pretty irresponsible. So let's take stock. On the one hand, we have an autocratic, anti-democratic, warmongering paramilitary group trying to evoke the symbols of the occult space fascist empire of days past. And on the other, we have a ruler who upholds repressive laws which deny romantic autonomy. Like, sure, he also invaded the land of the Amazons, but is this fascism? Do you know which other governments and dynasties have also had repressive laws and waged war? Like, all of them, even ours today. So, if Theseus's Athens is fascist, then so are, like, most places throughout history. And I think that's a silly claim to make, because again, it trivializes fascism, a very real and specific thing. This is Godwin's law in action. Now, if I wanted to be very, very generous, I could make an argument that as a result of this conceptual incoherence, perhaps accidentally, an interesting point is made. Militarism and authoritarianism are key tenets of fascism, both of which are present in Theseus's Athens. Obviously, there's way more to it than that. If you're wondering what that is, check out this video on screen now, where I investigate how fascist the world of an X-Men series was. I go a little more in depth about what makes something fascist specifically. But these two features, militarism and authoritarianism, are core parts of any truly fascist system. But as I suggested above, they aren't unique to fascism. They're overwhelmingly common even today around the world. Just look at the largely unjustifiable Western invasions in the Middle East over the past few decades. Look a little further back to Latin America. Militarism is a cornerstone of our modern Western status quo. And the US might not have Athens laws against free marriage, but Texas still has a law on its books against homosexual conduct. Davies' application of fascist imagery to Shakespeare's Athens is extreme and misguided, but it does serve as a reminder that fascism's core ideology is perhaps not as far removed from modern capitalism as we might think. What is it that they say? Cut a liberal and a fascist leads. So say what you will about the Star Wars sequels, they're a big mess, not least this first one. But the evocation of fascist ideology and imagery in The Force Awakens at least makes sense, and compared to some other modern engagements with the same ideas, such as this Midsummer Night's Dream adaptation, maybe it even did it pretty well. But that's it for this video. Make sure you come back next time for the video on why The Last Jedi was the best mainline Star Wars film in 30 years. And don't forget to dislike the video if you're a centrist who thinks the re-emergence of fascism isn't a serious concern. Or if you're a fascist yourself who was offended by the contents of the video. But then make sure you go and eat some shit afterwards. And again, I want to say a really big thank you to my patrons on screen now, and especially Ian Fifield. And if you want to see your name up here and get access to some bonus content, feel free to check out the Patreon link in the description below. But I've got to go now, I'm in the Hosnian system, and there's this weird bright red light in the sky, so I'm gonna go and check that out. Ciao.